Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner. Hey there, listeners. Did you know FNMC is hosting our New Music Festival October 11 through 13 in Omaha? Proposals are open through May 15th. But if you missed that date, we hope you'll still join us as we celebrate music for all instrumentations written in the past 50 years. Highlights will include the final round of our flute artist competition and world premieres of our consortium commission by Rena Esmail, as well as a special commission by Michael Janice. Visit www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com for all the details, and we'll see you in Omaha. Tim Hagen is an internationally acclaimed performer, composer, scholar, and educator. His flute playing has been praised for technical virtuosity and musical sensitivity, and he has been a prize winner at multiple major flute competitions. As a soloist, Hagen has appeared in concert at New York's 92nd Street Y and Lincoln Center, in addition to multiple concerto performances with the Missouri Symphony. He's currently principal flute of the Dubuque Symphony. In addition to his experience as a performer, Tim's compositions are performed by professional musicians across the country and have frequently won prizes from the National Flute Association since 2018. Both his music and his pedagogical writings are published under the Owlglass Music imprint, and his scholarly work has appeared in the journals of the National Flute Association and British Flute Society. As an educator, Hagen has worked with all ages and experience levels, having served on the music faculties of University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, University of North Carolina Greensboro, and Oklahoma State University, in addition to significant experience as a teaching artist and workshop facilitator with esteemed institutions such as the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Lincoln Center Education, and Dallas Symphony. Tim also won the solo category of FNMC's composition competition in 2023 with his piece, Blowout. Tim Hagen, welcome to Music Crush.
Thank you so much, Nicole Reiner and Elizabeth Robinson. It's so wonderful to be here with the two of you.
I feel like it's weird that we haven't met before. I don't know why. I mean, we don't have any schools in common necessarily, but maybe I think we're probably around the same age. I feel like we have a lot of mutual friends in this small world. So it's funny to finally be talking to you. I don't know what took so long.
You know, sometimes paths just take a while to intersect. So, but they finally have.
Yeah, hooray. Well, we are excited to talk to you about many things, but the most imminent piece of information, I suppose, is that you just won FNMC's composition competition in 2023 with Blowout. Can you tell us about the piece?
Yes, Blowout's a good time. It is the piece. Even the title of the piece isn't straightforward. It's a joke because the piece is really about various different ways you can make sound by blowing on the flute, and it really was inspired by my former teacher Jim Walker, who has this gift of being able to look at students and see abilities in them that they might not even know that they have. And before I was doing a lot of composing, I came to him, this was when I was a student at USC, going to do my second master's recital, and he said, I think you should write a piece for your recital. And he didn't even know I had done any composing or tinkering with composing at all at that point, which I had done quite a bit when I was younger, but nothing, I hadn't put anything out in the world. So that was a real sudden surprise that he just could look at me and see that I had an ability there. And so he specifically said to me a couple years later, because I did write a piece for that recital, it wasn't Blowout. He said to me a couple years later, you should write some kind of rock and roll, Ian Clark, Robert Dick style thing. And that was Blowout. And I wrote it for a scholars convention that I was going to for the Jack Kent Cooke Scholarship Foundation, because they were kind enough to pay for my master's at USC. So on my way to the convention after I had just graduated from USC, actually no, it was a couple years later, 2008, I went to another convention and I couldn't find anything I wanted to play in my music library. So I wrote Blowout in 48 hours or less, wrote the first big chunk of it on the airplane on my way to this convention that was on the East Coast. And people loved it. at the very first performance, and it is just a rockin', rollin' good time. There's a little bit of shakuhachi thrown in for good measure, and it's really just supposed to be fun and joyful.
That's amazing. So has it changed? I mean, since you wrote it so quickly, have you changed it at all since that first version, or is that still what we have today?
That's what you have today. And it's a great question because I have revised some of my music since I wrote it, but not Blowout. Blowout was one of those pieces that just came out the way it needed to be very quickly. And it's so funny too, because that's the first piece I ever really put out in the world back in 2008. And since then, I've written things that have been a lot harder to write. They're not necessarily longer, they're not necessarily more complex, but every piece has its own identity, and sometimes I kind of have to wrestle with it a little bit to get it the way I want, or I write it, it gets performed, I decide I'm not happy with it, so I revise it. But Blowout didn't have any of that. It just blew right out.
Yeah. I'm really curious. Have you talked to Jim Walker since about what caused him to make that very specific suggestion to you?
I've never asked him why. Although I can't, now that I'm thinking about it, I can't believe I've never asked him why. But I will say I've seen Jim do this over and over again with students, where he is just able to see inside people and, see pieces of them that he really wants to advocate for, that he believes could really help the student career-wise, that could help the world if the student puts this out in the world. And like I said, frequently it's things that you don't even know you can do when he says it to you. He's like a guru this way. And so even though I haven't asked him why, it's sort of part of the Jim Walker experience, I think.
That's fascinating.
Superpowers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's so intuitive. And that changed my life because that really got me started composing seriously. And, it was slow for a number of years. Pieces sort of got written very slowly. But for about the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a real accelerando in terms of how much people are asking me to write, the frequency with which I'm getting commissioned. So, it all really started with Blowout.
You created a perfect segue for my next question, which is huge. Sorry, do whatever you would like with this question. But your bio reflects a hefty trifecta: performing, composing, teaching, everything, right? Everything we do, you do. And furthermore, if we break down the various ways in which you perform, I personally find orchestral playing to be so vastly different from chamber, and that's different from solo playing, and particularly if you lean heavily towards new music. That's also another kind of mindset and way of being on stage, and you do all of these things regularly. Can you take us through each of these aspects of your life? What are your big takeaways from each hat that you wear? How has each informed who you are professionally? Wherever you want to go with this question, but I think your bio is amazing.
Well, thank you. And it's so funny because I started having my, what we call now a portfolio career at a time when that wasn't a thing. Yeah. And the way it all came about is I would just say yes to opportunities that I was offered, even if I wasn't sure I could do them well. And between saying yes and when I actually had to do whatever the thing was, I would figure it out. Which I think is an important lesson to learn early on. And I don't remember ever being really scared of all of these different things because I'm genuinely interested in all of these areas that you mentioned, just like I'm interested in, artistry in general outside music. I'm just a very curious person. I like to explore. And so I think that that's sort of maybe at the foundation of all of this. I was the kid who got talks too much on my report card in elementary school. I didn't like to sit still. I once went on strike in first grade, although I didn't know that that's what I was doing because I was so bored with my classwork. I thought it was dumb. I thought I already know how to do all this stuff, so I'm just not going to do anything for a month. And then I finally got called out for not having turned any work in a month, and my parents weren't very pleased. But it was, that's a story I think of as referring to a part of myself that really hasn't changed. I do get easily bored. So, and so I suppose foundationally in my personality, that's a lot of that's at play. Thinking about performance just by itself and the different areas of performance that you mentioned, Nicole, I suppose that my philosophy about musical style might be what sort of helps me there. My whole sort of shtick when it comes to being a performing musician, to teaching students who want to, whether they want to be music educators or performers or both. We talk a lot about style because I think style is the umbrella that everything else falls underneath. Who wrote the piece? When was it written? What's the orchestration? And the instrumentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things inform the way a piece, the considerations we make when we play a piece. And so I have over the years developed a pretty good sort of sonic imaginary encyclopedia of what differentiates one style from another. And so I have a certain set of considerations that I'm concentrating on when I play orchestral music, and then, as opposed to new music, which is often harmonically much more adventurous, technically more challenging. Frequently in new music, the flute is called upon to play a solo role in many different ways. It's an instrument that's just beloved by composers at this point, which is great because we really had it rough at the end of the 19th century. And so it's just, for me, it's about honing in on the style of whatever I'm playing, what the piece is, what the context is, what the environment I'm playing is, and drawing on my abilities as an artist to be able to really hammer that style home. And so that's, that kind of acute awareness of style is really, really important. And then in terms of balancing, performing versus teaching versus composing, what I say is that it's really tough to be really engaged with even two of those things at the very same time. So I sort of juggle them. I have periods where I am more doing a lot of intensive teaching. And so when I'm doing that, that's sort of my main thing, and composing and performing frequently take a back seat. And then, a couple weeks later, I'll have an extensive performing week. And so teaching and composition have to take a back seat. And then if I have a commission that's coming due, performing and teaching take a back seat. And so I always say that these are things I juggle, and if I haven't, if I've lost contact with one of these things that I'm juggling, I don't know, balls, traffic cones, chainsaws, whatever it is I'm juggling, I've lost contact with one for a little while, I really start to miss it. And so I make efforts to, if I've been doing some intensive teaching for an extended period of time, I want to get back to performing or composing as soon as possible. And it's that way with each one of those things. They all challenge me in very different ways, and I really enjoy having all of those challenges, and they all inform each other. This is a good chance to make a plug for all performers. I really, really believe that all performers should compose, because it gives, even if nobody ever hears your music, it's never played by anybody, it just gives you a completely different perspective when you're performing. One example I like to use is, it wasn't until I started composing that I realized just how important words in scores are. And that, if I put a word in a score, I have to take time to do that. I have to take time to format it. I have to make sure it's going to carry over to all the parts, etc. Like it's a thing that takes time and energy. And so when you see a word in somebody else's score, they went, even, if we're talking about old scores that are not created electronically, the composer had to take time, energy, intention to put that word in the score. So, it just really changes your perspective. And I think it's really important. And by the way, I believe the reverse is true too. I think composers, people who make their primary living by composing, should be performing so that they're still experiencing that in-person visceral contact with the audience, because that is one of the best, fastest ways to learn what works musically and what doesn't, is to be in that position, actually. So it can really raise the bar on your composing. So yeah, that's just a brief glimpse inside my crazy mind.
Yeah, I have felt that way as a performer too. There's something about the psychology of the way music looks on the page, and sometimes a composer will give it to me, and there's nothing wrong with it, but still, when you're trying to play it, something about it is confusing, and you can't even figure out how to describe what it is. And I wonder if that's that disconnect between, what it feels like to be a performer on stage ever with someone else's music. To just get a sense of how to make a score feel more attainable to the performer.
Yeah, 100%. And when you're composing, I often find, or at least for me, I find that I think about a lot what is attainable for a wide range of performers, because I love, most of my music, I'd love it to be performed widely. Sometimes I just want to write something very specific that I know may not get a ton of performances because it has particular demands that most people don't want to be bothered with. But usually that's not the route I go. And so, I think going through the process yourself really makes you start asking questions like, why did the composer, if you didn't write the piece you're playing, why did the composer write this passage? Why is this figure here? Why is it so important? Especially if it's challenging, it's good for performers to start asking, what's the expressive meaning of this thing that I'm playing? Because I think that can, just like the way a score is laid out on the page, that can look, because even things like layout can make a score look more accessible or more intimidating. And I feel like this plays into the same idea of, when performers start to consider, why did the composer do this? What does this have to do with, how does this intersect with my own interpretation of the piece? What's the meaning of this thing? Having these whys, WHYS, these whys answered, or even just exploring the questions, I think can really spur performers on and make them more invested in the music they're playing.
You've already talked a little bit about the various hats that you juggle, the teaching, the performing, and the composing. And you've sort of described how you handle those in the short term, i.e., this is the thing that's due next, or this is the thing that's up on my calendar next. Can you talk a little bit about how you plan for all three of those versions of Tim in the long term?
Yeah, I am a meticulous, I live and die by my calendar, meticulous note taker, to-do list maker. I'm a big fan of having a list so I can check things off of it. And even despite that, I'll still mess up because I have so many, this is not a complaint, it's just an observation. I have so many opportunities coming my way sometimes all at the same time that it's still really easy to mess up the calendar, but I really, really do try to, as soon as someone tells me we'd like you to do this thing, or I accept some kind of invitation, it's got to go in the calendar. My student, I've been teaching long enough that there was a period, even though I'm I'm actually not teaching much right now. It's about to change. But when I've had multiple students in the past, 10 students or so, I'll always just sort of as a default thing at the end of a lesson say, all right, I'll see you next week. And invariably the student will go, no, we have XYZ tonight or tomorrow. Or it's like, no, I'll see you at flute choir. I'll see you at studio class. And so I've just started telling students, I'll see you the next time my calendar says I'm supposed to see you, because I just go where the calendar tells me to go. And so, that to me, that's really indispensable. I actually am someone who likes electronic calendars because they sync among all my devices. So whatever screen has my attention at any given time, I can access my calendar through that. So, just being really intentional about writing everything down that I'm doing, that's a huge part of the organizational process. Also trying to be really reasonable with myself about deadlines. I find that this is, if I get offered a last minute performance opportunity and I can make it work without making the rest of my life really difficult, I'll do it. And the same goes for teaching, which happens less often, and composing, which happens even less often. With composing, when setting commission due dates, I try to, again, be very reasonable. I look at, because I'm such a big write every single thing in the calendar, I look at the calendar when I'm considering a due date and think, okay, between now and whenever this is going to ostensibly be due, what do I have on my plate? And are these things I have on my plate, because I want to do things well. I'm not a perfectionist, but I do want to do things well. Can I reasonably expect myself to do all of these commitments that I've got lined up well, and then finish the piece on time and have it be something that I'm really happy with? So it's just a lot of reflecting on the calendar, reflecting on my time. And now I'm at a point in my career where I'm grateful to be able to say no to some things. And sometimes you have to do that too. You have to say no to a great opportunity because it would steal time from another commitment you already have, or because you have another opportunity at about the same time and you just can't get ready for both of them at the same time. So, I don't have anything revolutionary to say here, so I hope that's helpful to somebody. But, writing things down, checking them off, that's a life changer.
I think I'm really interested in this idea of when to say no, particularly for somebody like yourself who does multiple things at a very high level. And for somebody who's already described how those multiple things that you do are equally important to you and are equal parts of your identity. Do you have a system or a plan in place for which opportunities you take and which opportunities you maybe let pass? Or do you have any words of wisdom for other people who are trying to be high level and multifaceted, but only have the same 24 hours in the day?
Yeah, I think so. Something I ask musicians I work with, like sort of students, mentees, to do sometimes is craft a mission statement that reflects who they are as an artist and what their goals are, what their why. Why are you doing what you do? And so I think that keeping in close contact with that mission, your why, which evolves over time and can even change from one month to the next, depending on what's on your plate. I think staying in touch with that mission can keep you from doing what they call in business mission creep. And so, where an organization starts with a mission and then just sort of slowly starts to engage in other activities that may not really serve that mission, but seem like a good idea for whatever reason. Maybe they bring in money, maybe they are, important networking opportunities. But I recommend for artists to look at their work the same way, have a very clear idea of who you are in the world, what you think your function is, what you're trying to do. And then opportunities that connect to that, prioritize those opportunities. Opportunities that don't connect to that, sometimes we have to say yes to those things because, again, a minute ago, like I said, money is we live in a capitalistic society. We have bills to pay. We need roofs over our heads, things, small things like that. So, being able to, you've got to say yes sometimes to things that maybe aren't central to your mission. But frequently, especially as you age, you become more experienced, opportunities start coming to you more easily rather than you having to pursue them all the time, which I find is another outcome of becoming more experienced. Then you will likely find yourself in a position where you have enough money coming in the door. And so you can start saying, well, this project, this thing someone's asked me to do doesn't excite me as much as I wish it did. It's not really connected to my why, my mission. I think I'm going to say no to this thing. And I'm going to be okay with that. And it's scary because, it's also very true that if you say no to people like contractors, personnel managers, things like that, if you say no too many times, they'll just stop calling. So if it's an organization you want to maintain some kind of relationship with, you have to find the balance, of when to say no and when to say yes. But even in those situations, a lot of times my no's are no buts. No, but here's a list of 5 people who live here who I know could do the gig extraordinarily well. No, I unfortunately don't have time for this, but you should get in touch with these three, try these three people, because they are also very knowledgeable about this thing that you're asking me about, and they may have the time and the bandwidth. And so I try not to ever just give a blanket, no, go away. Because relationships are very important to me. I think relationships are really central to all of our lives, both just as they satisfy the need for human connection that we all have. I think is super important for artists, but also good relationships are how people are able to succeed. No one's an island. You can't do anything truly by yourself. And so finding ways to say no while keeping relationships intact and healthy as much as I can is important. That said, if you say no and someone wants to get mad about it, they're going to get mad about it. And you have to just learn, you have to shore up your own self-esteem and go, okay, well, I couldn't do this thing. I tell students a lot, when you start setting boundaries, you're going to have to start being willing to disappoint people. And so I think that that plays a part in it too. But again, you want to juggle that with how much do I want to disappoint a person? How many people do I want to disappoint? Who can I not disappoint? I think questions like that are helpful too.
As we were sort of digging through your online materials in preparation to talk with you today, I learned that you have a podcast called Rally, a podcast about resilient people for resilient people, which is a title that I deeply enjoy. What have you learned in your time doing the show, and were there any surprises?
That's a great question. One thing I learned really quickly is I just simply do not have the time and the patience to do the interviewing and the editing myself with everything else I have going on. So that's why there are only 3 episodes of the show. There are actually 2 more that I've recorded and just never got around to editing. And it's something I'd love to keep going, but I'm going to need a collaborator at some point. And I'm going to need, a producer, an editor, someone to work with, because it is, as you both know, extremely time consuming. Like, the interview's easy. The really time consuming part is the editing. And so, I really need a partner there. So that's something I learned really early, although I'm very proud of the 3 episodes that got out in the world. I feel like they got progressively better. I learned really quickly in the first episode, where I'm interviewing Brian Raphael Neighbors, who's a fabulous composer. And it was my first time doing a recorded, being an interviewer on a recording. And so I think there were opportunities I had to kind of redirect him, or to, move through the interview a little more expeditiously, that I didn't take advantage of the first time because I was just sort of getting my bearings. I feel like I got better at that with the next 2 interviews, actually the next 4 interviews, because 2 of them you can listen to, 2 of them not yet. But I got better at being able to move the interview forward when I needed to, but also being able to take a detour when someone said something really interesting. Because I think that's important when you're interviewing somebody, is to really listen to them and really try to understand what they're saying, connect with them in the moment, so that if they say something that you think, oh, this could be a really interesting detour, you're able to take advantage of it. Another big thing I would say, I went into interviewing knowing this theoretically. So I guess it, the whole process of doing the podcast made it clear that this wasn't just theoretical knowledge, it was actual real practical knowledge. It's so important to research your subject. In my opinion, you don't want to go in asking the same questions everybody else has asked 1,000 times. It's indispensable to find interviews this person's done before, if they've done any, listen to or read those interviews, depending on what format they're in. If they're an artist, review their work, read their bio, find out as much as you can about them within reason. Because the more you know about your subject, the more interesting questions I find you can ask. And also for me, the more I learned about a subject. This was certainly true with Adolphus Hailstork, who was one of the interviews that has not been released yet. But the more I learned about him and his work, the more questions I had, the more curious I was, actually. And so I would say, in terms of things that were maybe surprising, that was something that was surprising. That, yeah, I found the answers to a lot of questions I had just from researching him, but then those questions gave rise to more questions.
Do you have any favorite Adolphus Hailstork trivia? I'm having a little bit of a Hailstork obsession phase right now.
I am just struck by how active he still is, in his 80s, and we're especially lucky as flutists. He keeps writing for us and over and over and over again. It's really fantastic, and all the pieces are really like Ewa is so different in style from Pied Piper of Harlem. It's so different in style from Flute Set. It's so different in style from some of the newer pieces like St. Paul Blues. So it's he's so eclectic. But here's a little bit of trivia in terms of how he works, and so maybe this could be helpful for musicians who are listening to our discussion a little bit earlier when we were talking about how do you cram everything into those same 24 hours. On his calendar, he'll plan out what he's going to work on like every day for a month. And it's not the same thing every day, and he sticks to it. So like, on the first of whatever the month is, the first of the month, I'm going to work on this commission. On the second of the month, I'm going to edit this music. On the third of the month, he has a task or a set of tasks for every day. And he's really good about doing what he has set out for himself to do and not letting himself get sidetracked. Because I am someone who is, being sidetracked is very tempting to me. If I'm working on something one day and I know I have to do something different the next day, but I'm kind of really cooking with what I'm doing on day one, it's really tempting to carry that over into day two. And he just says, absolutely not. No, I do what the calendar says. And no matter how much I want to continue working on something else, I'll come back to it when it's on the calendar. So that's just sort of a little bit more trivia about him. And I think this extremely disciplined approach is part of what enables him to be so prolific.
Speaking of discipline, maybe we'll be speaking of this. Can you tell us about your scientific method of practicing?
Yes. So that came about in sort of the seeds for that were planted around 2008, 2009. I was living in Los Angeles. I was out of school. I was just freelancing and teaching and having a life, which was wonderful. And I had about 10 private students at that time. And most of them were super gung-ho about the flute, really seemed very driven to get better and grow. But I realized that they weren't progressing as much as I thought they could from one lesson to the next. And it became clear that this was a pattern over time. And so I started reflecting on, why is this happening? What's going on? And I sort of arrived at one of two answers. Either they weren't practicing, they weren't doing the work. And I didn't think that was it, because in their lessons, they seemed to really want to improve. And I just didn't get the vibe that they were slacking off. We all have those teacher antennas that we know when someone's really not doing the work. So I didn't think that was it. So I arrived at the other conclusion, which was they don't know how to practice. And once I realized that they don't know how to practice, the next step was, okay, that means I'm their teacher. I need to help them learn how to practice. I need to teach them how to practice. Then I got to the shocking realization in my late 20s, here I am, a professional musician ostensibly, and I didn't have any well-formed ideas about how to practice. I was basically someone who just repeated something over and over again in hopes that it would get better. And it usually did get better, but there was no systematic thinking there. There was no real critical thinking. So I started doing some research. I read this wonderful book that at the time was fairly new called Bounce by Matthew Syed. And that book it basically details the neurological underpinnings of successful people. Syed he's British. He at one point was the #1 table tennis player in the world. And after he retired from competitive table tennis, he wrote this book where he really wanted to know, how is it that I became the #1 table tennis player in the world? Like, how did that actually happen? Not just anecdotally, but scientifically. How did the learning happen? How did the skill building happen? How did Picasso become, one of the world's great artists? How did Mozart become the legendary composer? And the book walks you through several chapters, each sort of taking a different neurological point of view about phenomena in the brain that happen when we learn. And so that book gave me a lot of good information about, sort of biological underpinnings of good learning. It sent me to other books that I have found to be incredibly helpful, like Mindset by Carol Dweck, who is a Stanford Emerita faculty member in psychology, and her whole body of work is around what she has termed mindset, which is the set of attitudes we each have, beliefs about ourselves and our work. And in the book, she makes a really compelling case for how those beliefs actually determine who is successful and to what degree, to a large part. Another book that I got pointed to, William Westney's The Perfect Wrong Note, really changed my life as a musician, really made me rethink what I believed about mistakes and their role in the learning process. And then during my doctoral studies at UT Austin, 2011 to 14, I took a course with Bob Duke, who was the head of and still is the head of music and human learning there. And that I call the course, I can't even remember what the course title was, but in my head it was How to Teach. And How to Teach is also how to learn. And two sides of the same coin. And so I took a lot of fantastic information from that course, because Dr. Duke is one of the most knowledgeable people about the psychology and the neuroscience of learning that I've ever met. And so, the short answer is I got really curious about how to practice, because I wanted to get better at it for my students and for myself. And then it was just a journey over several years of pursuing information from a lot of different sources. And then it was fall of 2014 that I put it all together in my little booklet, The Scientific Method of Practicing. And it's very short. It's 36 pages. You can easily read it in an hour. I've tried to make it very user-friendly, not using a ton of technical terminology from science and psychology, or if I do use it, trying to explain it in a way people, the layperson can understand. And that, the process of doing all that research, writing the little booklet, really changed me as a musician, because at the end of it, I knew how to practice. And since then, I've only added new ideas. At some point, on my long list of things I want to get done, there's going to be a second edition, because I've learned new things that aren't in the book that I find are really, really helpful over the years. And so that's basically what it is. And I've been very fortunate that various music studios, even non-flutists around the country, have used the book with their students to talk about how we practice. I even at one point parlayed the book into a class I taught for a semester called The Practicing Mind, where students, it was for students, and I actually wanted it to be for students from any discipline. As long as what you do is skill-based in some way, the concepts in the book apply to you. So it doesn't have to be for musicians. It can be for pretty much any artist. It can be for athletes. It can be for, anybody who wants to get better at anything. That is, I suppose maybe the final takeaway from the process of putting that book together is, I really do believe that every human being, most of us have standard issue hardware in here in our brains, and we are all capable of growth, of improving. And this little booklet just sort of lays out with you, important structural principles of how you do get better at something.
So what's next for you? What's on your workbench right now?
Oh gosh, oh my goodness, what is on the workbench? I am, let's see, let me go in order. I I'll be starting at Central Michigan University as a sabbatical replacement for Dr. Joanna White, who's a wonderful flutist advocate for musicians with injuries. She's done this amazing body of work around focal dystonia, body of research around focal dystonia. Beautiful player, wonderful teacher, wonderful human. So I'm really very grateful that she and her colleagues are entrusting me with her studio for a semester. So I'll be on the road a lot, going to Michigan. The orchestra I play in, the Dubuque Symphony, we have, sort of the second half of our season will start up in February, and it's, big orchestral heavyweight pieces. So Prokofiev, Romeo and Juliet, Brahms 4, which I've never gotten to play before, Shostakovich 5. So there's a lot there. I have a commission for oboe and piano that I'm actually working on right now that I'm trying to wrap up as quickly as possible, a sonatina. After that, I have a commission for flute, voice, and electronics, and a commission for clarinet and saxophone. So those will be things I'll work on over the coming months, as well as my flute concerto that Dubuque Symphony has commissioned and will be premiered next season. So I've got to get that written. It's already mapped out in my head. So that's the teaching, and that's there it is, all three: the teaching, the performing, and the composing. They're all. I have workbench stuff ready to go in all of those areas. So it's just a matter of trying to hold to the calendar and get it all done. And I got to say, I'm pretty good with deadlines. Sometimes when I compose, I'll miss a deadline, but it won't be by much. I'm not one of those, can I get this piece to you 7 months late kind of composers. That would keep me up at night. I couldn't do it.
Thank you for that on behalf of
Yeah.
all performers.
Yeah, you're welcome.
When is the concerto?
It will be either next October of 24 or February of 25. We're
That's
still
exciting.
deciding. I'm hoping, yes, thank you. I'm hoping our music director goes with February because that just buys me more time. So even though I do have the whole thing planned out in my head already, I know I will hit speed bumps when I start to write. I will always, I try not to be late with things, but if someone offers me more time, I will pretty much always take it. And this is my first time writing something for orchestra, which is also very exciting. And it's one of these things where I've played in enough orchestras for long enough that I have no doubt that I'll be able to do it. I'm just really excited to do it. And I did take orchestration in my undergrad, a year of orchestration with a really fabulous composer. And so, I learned all the basics then, but nothing teaches you orchestration like playing in the orchestra and listening as you play.
I can only imagine. With the answer to the what's on your workbench question, I'm now really intrigued to see what you do with our next question. We've been asking this to many of the composers that we've interviewed. I don't think we've had the opportunity to ask a combo composer and performer, so that could already make it exciting. If you had the opportunity to sort of manifest a dream collaboration, if somebody called you tomorrow and said, "Hey, Tim, we want you to work on this, and we want you to work on it with these people," who would be calling you, and what would they want you to do?
There's a different project I'm working on slowly that I didn't mention a minute ago, but my answer to your question would connect to that. So I'm writing a one-person show about my life that weaves storytelling and music performance together. And so, I'd love if NPR called me and said, "Hey, we want to figure out a way to turn this into a regular show." That would be an example of a dream collaboration. I am really, I love visual art. One of my favorite things to do is just spend time in art museums. I always walk away having new insights about music. And so, if the Art Institute of Chicago called me up or the Museum of Modern Art in New York and said, "Hey, we want to curate some kind of interactive experience with music and our collection, and we want you to be the artistic director," that would be a dream collab too. I also really, really love fashion, and so if there was ever, one of my favorite designers is Christian Siriano. I think the clothes are beautiful. I love how he designs without regard to gender norms. He really designs for individual humans, and so if there was ever some way to collaborate with Siriano, that would be amazing to me.
Well, we always love closing with some version of this question, Tim. What are 3 pieces of music you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
The very first piece that jumps into my brain when you ask that question is Kate Soper's "Only the Words Themselves Mean What They Say," which is a piece for flute and soprano. Kate wrote it actually for her to be the soprano to play it. I think initially she did it with Aaron Lesser. My personal favorite recording is Erica Boyson's recording that you can find on YouTube. It is that I just am jaw on the floor every time I listen to that piece, because it is so wildly imaginative, and it is just sort of next level virtuosity on behalf of both performers, because it's not really just about playing, putting the right notes in the right place at the right time. It's about being highly expressive while you do it. The colors she creates in that piece are so distinct, I think, to her music. And that piece really, every time I listen to it, I walk away incredibly inspired by what is possible for human beings to create. So that's very high on my list. There's a really fantastic piece by Alex Temple, who is a composer who lives in Arizona now, for flute, piano, and electronics. And for people who are intimidated by electronics, whether as a listener or as a performer, this is a really great kind of starter piece, because it's actually pretty simple to put together with the electronics. It's a tape part, so it's not like the electronics, or there aren't overwhelming technical demands. This piece is called Willingly, and it's based on a prompt that Alex gave people that went something to the tune of, 10 years ago, I never imagined I would willingly blank. And people have to fill in the blank. And people say all kinds of things. Some of them are very funny. Some of them are sad. Some of them are even poignant. And that piece it's just a really beautifully written piece. It's actually kind of spare, so that the music really just sort of creates a beautiful cushion for the words, the text that you hear in the electronics. But it's still really engaging to play. I think it's really engaging to listen to. So that's another piece that is very high on my list. And then I'm choosing this piece in the moment. I'm pulling it out of thin air, actually. And the reason I'm going to suggest it is because I feel like this piece reminds us that everyone is a three-dimensional person with a lot of different parts. And this is kind of a deep cut. It's not new necessarily. Arnold Schoenberg's Gurre-Lieder. I think people should listen to this piece, because when we think about Schoenberg, we think about, it's academic and it's atonal, and then it's 12 tone, and it's people just tend to have abrasive reactions to his music. If you listen to Gurre-Lieder, which is for a massive orchestra and chorus, it feels like you're just like awash in German romanticism. And it's sort of, Schoenberg's starting point that he departed from later. But I love that piece and some of his other, real neo-romantics. I guess it wouldn't have even been neo-romantic, because he was writing at the end of the Romantic era, but, Transfigured Night, things like that. Those pieces are really fantastic reminders that someone is, that we are all people with many different facets, no matter how we come across. And just when you think you've pigeonholed somebody, they will surprise you.
I love your taste.
Thank you. I love listening to music. So I am always listening to music, always trying to find new composers. One of my favorite composers I've recently discovered right now is Rena Esmail. Just all of her music is just beautiful, and sort of I feel like I started college in 1999 at a time when we were kind of coming, music history was just starting to acknowledge, music history courses were just starting to acknowledge, music written after serialism and just starting to acknowledge neo-romanticism and things like that. And so I love that we're living in a time now, 20 years later, 25 years later, where beautiful music, music that's just beautiful, it exists just to be beautiful, is being written again. And that's me describing Rina Ishmael's music. I'm certain that is a very simplistic way of describing it, but I will say that's what jumps out at me about it, is just its beauty. So if I had to strong arm myself into a fourth answer, it would say anything by Rina Ishmael.
Tim, this has been so inspiring, and I've learned so much. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Flute New Music Consortium for everything you do to support the creation of new music for our instrument. It's been such a pleasure the last few months. I was hopeful when I entered the competition. I was thrilled when Blowout won, and just so happy to spend some time with you today.
Yeah, us too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.